left-hand side of the screen. If you weren't already doing that, I don't know how you would be hearing me say that, but there are many people joining us today, so we've automatically muted the lines of your participants to reduce background noise. If you're not a presenter, please keep your phone muted. If you have questions for the presenters, we encourage you to submit them using the chat feature on the right side of your screen. If you would please send your questions to all presenters from the drop-down menu next to the text box, then somebody over here will be able to see it. If you want to communicate with JRSA staff during the webinar, please submit your comment using the chat feature to Jason Trask or host. The session is scheduled for an hour and a half, and we will end promptly at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, if not earlier. If you have technical difficulties or get disconnected during the session, you can reconnect to the session using the same link that you used initially to join us, or you can call WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239. In the last 5 minutes of today's webinar, we will ask you to complete a short survey. The information you provide will help us to plan and improve future webinars and meet our reporting requirements. The full bio for our speaker is on JRSA's website, but I want to briefly introduce Baron to you. Baron Blakely has been a research specialist with the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services Criminal Justice Research Center for 10 years. During that time, he's worked on a range of research projects, including the annual jail forecast, analysis of drug specimen data from the Department of Forensic Sciences, gang studies, and program evaluations. I hope that's more fun than it sounds like when you hear it. Previously, he was the research supervisor at the Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice, where he helped create the agency's annual data resource guide and its custody classification instrument. His areas of focus have included jail trends and analysis, the jail population forecast, juvenile corrections, risk and protective factors for young offenders, trends in drug availability, the connections between socioeconomic stressors and violent crime, and a bunch of other things. Baron received his master's degree in criminology from University of Maryland, College Park, and his BA in sociology and criminal justice from the University of Richmond
a long time ago,
right down the street a few miles from where we are currently sitting. Baron, thank you so much for being willing to do this today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stan. All right, everybody, this is my first webinar, so I'm going to assume that you're all out there and watching, but on the positive side, if you wish, you could be playing Angry Birds. I won't notice. All right, I want to talk a little bit about Virginia's jails, the jail data system, which is the LIDS, Local Inmate Data System. Basically, a few weeks ago, I was showing Stan some of what we can do here in Virginia with that data, what we're able to do in terms of identifying what the trends are in jails and what's going on in the jails. And he told me that this isn't really something he's seeing from other states, and he asked if we could talk about it. And I figured, sure, I can talk about it. I talk about it a lot. So let's go ahead and dive on in. First, I want to talk about, introduce you to Virginia's jails, because Virginia's jails are a little bit different. The system is a little bit different than other states. In fact, it's very different from some states. Essentially, as you can see from the quote there, the quote comes from a 1937 study that I found when I was doing some research a while back. Virginia's system really is a very peculiar one. We have local autonomy in some ways, and we have regional jails as well. The state puts a lot of money into the jails and has some inspection and oversight, but really doesn't have any control over the jails themselves. So it is a very strange situation. The Virginia Compensation Board is the agency that actually developed this database, the LIDS database, and the primary purpose for that is to provide per diem reimbursements to localities for inmates in the jails. They reimburse for local and state responsible offenders, and to manage that, to identify who's there and how long and what types of offenders are there, they developed this system. It also was developed for some other purposes, but primarily for that. The jails hold a number of different types of inmates. Primarily, what I'll be talking about mostly today is local responsible. Local responsible inmates include those who are there pretrial, those who've been sentenced but still have pending charges, sentenced misdemeanants, felons who've been sentenced to jail for 12 months or less, and ordinance violators. there are also the state responsible offenders who are essentially waiting to go to DOC, Department of Corrections, and there are some federal. I don't really work with those populations much in analysis, and my focus here has been primarily the local inmates. All right, so a little bit about LIDS. Like I said, it's maintained by the Compensation Board. That's prior to May 2013, or starting prior to June 2013, really. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The primary purpose is, again, to determine the per diem payments, but it does track persons entering and exiting jails, along with a variety of other data, including demographics, what their status within the jail is, and various other factors, including court and offenses. But starting in June 2013, the LIDS database was brought into Department of Corrections system, that's the CORUS system, and there have been some difficulties in implementation. I don't have anything to do with that, so I really can't get into details about it. But so far, new data with the level of detail that I'm used to working with have been unavailable. So what I'll be talking about is analysis that we've done up through May 2013. We should be able to do all the rest of it later, but we're not quite there yet. All right. So LIDS, like I said, it can be used for the financial reimbursement. The secondary purpose is actually for the jails themselves. The jails have access to LIDS. Some actually use it. Some others use a proprietary system that they then use to export data to LIDS. But either way, they'll be using it from an inmate management perspective. And then in research. Historically, we haven't used it for much research until really the past several years, other than for that first one listed there, the offender population forecasting. Every year in Virginia, we have an offender population committee that gets together, and they do a variety of, we go through a lot of information to produce technical forecasts, and then there's policymakers who get in there and offer some policy adjustments. But so we've used it for a long time at the aggregate level, looking just at really the total average daily population. And then we've started recently in the past few years using it to analyze jail trends, the types of offenders in the jails and what's going on, and started discovering that with the jail data we can actually find what's going on in other parts of the criminal justice system, things that we might not have popped out otherwise. Because the jail data is updated monthly, so we can find out what's going on pretty quickly. And then finally, we also can use it for some recidivism analysis and program evaluation. So I'm going to jump into the population data that we would use for the forecast. So this right here is the total jail population. We're looking at the end of month data. We can look at this either through end of month, as end of month data, which would be on that one single day of the month, or average daily population. Historically, we've used the average daily population data for the forecast because it's a bit more stable. You can see how the lines here are kind of jumpy. But it looks like we're going to have data, we're going to have end of month data available for the forecast this year before the ADP will be ready. So since I'm going to be doing a lot more end of month data, I decided to go ahead and use that here. And I'll be talking a little more as we go along with how that really differs, because part of what I'm talking about really is how you can take a database that was not intended for data analysis, but actually try to find ways to use it to analyze parts of the criminal justice system. And there are definitely strengths as well as weaknesses in the data. Anyway, so this is the end of month population. You see it's broken out. You can see the federal offenders on top, the green, and the state responsible, and everything below that is local responsible. You can see definitely has exceeded capacity within the jails, although capacity is a somewhat loose term. That is the rated capacity. That's not assuming double bunking, which I know is a contested issue that some say we should assume double bunking. I'm not going to get into that. And it's broken out into local population, as you can see, is broken out into 4 primary subpopulations: the pretrial, the sentence pending charges, local responsible felon, and misdemeanors, and then a little bit of ordinance. But the ordinance violators are pretty small. And again, as you can see, it is a pretty noisy line. This graph right here, this slide right here, compares the end of month population in green to the average daily population that we've used historically in blue. And you can really see that the level stays the same, the trend is exactly the same, but it's a very jumpy. So it's a much noisier data stream. So from a forecasting perspective, that's a little bit of a concern because noise is a problem when you're doing time series analysis. And it can also make things difficult when doing trend analysis in general. But overall, averaging out the end-of-month population and comparing it to the average daily population, it's been within about half a percentage point. So we feel confident we're looking at the same thing, but we have these spikes. So what are the spikes? Well, the spikes are misdemeanors. And they're not misdemeanors every month, they're misdemeanors who are serving weekends. And so these green bars here are months in which the end of month occurs on a weekend. And that means you're going to have offenders who have been sentenced to a weekend commitment are only going to be there on the weekends. On the weekdays, you're going to have a lower population. And what we've seen is overall the misdemeanor weekend population is about 30% higher than the weekday population, which is something actually we couldn't look at without this end-of-month analysis. When we were using just the average daily population, we had a much smoother line, and it was less clear what the variation was between weekday and weekend. You can see there are a few dips in the data, say like between July 07 and July 08. You can see that one big drop. Well, that's December. You can see other years in which there's a big drop. So in December, not surprisingly, there's a somewhat smaller population in the jail. And that actually highlights here, it is some weekends that we see the spikes in the jail, but it's not every weekend. In between, it's not every weekend. If the end of month is in December, there's no weekend impact, which is interesting, particularly if you're having to do this forecast, because you need to know what you're looking at and know when to control for weekenders and when you don't need to. So for December, so when I'm doing the forecast, I'm going to have a dummy variable that accounts for the weekend, or find another way to deal with it, and I have to make sure that I'm dealing with it only for weekends that are not occurring in December. But this is an important factor to consider, because you have to understand when you're analyzing the data, this 30% jump on weekends, because if you're looking for a trend, let's take June. June is the last month of our fiscal year in Virginia, so it's very common to look at June data and compare them as just to get a sense of year-over-year changes. If you were to compare June of 2011 to June 2012, you would find a 19% increase in the jail population, in the misdemeanor population, and you might think something's going on, but it turns out that June 30th, 2012 is a Saturday, and so therefore you've got that 30% bump. Once you correct for the weekender, you actually find out the jail population dropped slightly between 2011 and 2012. So obviously a different picture, and very important for the analysts to understand when they're presenting it to policymakers. All right, so getting into the data itself. Looking here at, again, ADP end of month. All right, with misdemeanors, we saw one issue. With pretrial, we actually see a completely different issue. Here, although the average daily population for an end of month for the total local responsible population was right on, pretty much spot on within a single percentage point. Here, we're looking at 15% or more, or the end of month is 15% more higher than the ADP. All right, so what's going on there? What's going on is that in LIDS, and this is a problem, but it's a reason why end of month is actually better in this case. In LIDS, the offender's confinement status is overwritten when it changes. So if you have someone in their pretrial and they are sentenced and they go through sentencing and they're sentenced, say, to time served and released, then if they were not released until that point, their status may have been overwritten to serving sentence and released time served. And so then when we go back and look at the analysis, we find out that we count them as offenders serving a sentence for a misdemeanor or a local responsible felon. But for data on the end of the month, you don't lose as much of that change. Where you really lose the cases that are overwritten are the short term, the ones that turn around pretty quickly, and you don't lose those if you look at just the end of the month. On the end of the month, you're finding out everyone who was in pretrial on that day, and we didn't realize what the difference was. We knew there was a difference, but we did not realize until we started really looking closely that there really is a more than 15% percentage point difference between what we thought the pretrial population was and what it actually was. So what is the difference? Well, we look here at looking at most serious committing offense within pretrial for fiscal year 2012 for the ADP and for the end of month. And we can see, although they're very similar, the percentage in ADP for violent felons who are there whose most serious offense is a violent felony is larger than pretrial. Larger than the pretrial end of month population, while the misdemeanor is smaller. And so what's happening is that the more violent felons are sticking around longer in pretrial. So when you get to the average daily population, you still count them there. But the misdemeanors are ending up being released more quickly, or else sentenced more quickly, and theirs are the statuses that are being changed. So that's really where we're getting a difference. So when we look at the ADP for pretrial, we're looking at a smaller population with a more concentrated serious offender. All right, so given that, we're looking at now at the statewide average end of month population by most serious committing offense for pretrial. And you can see now the scale is different on each one of these, but you can get a sense of what the offenses look like and also the pattern. And I want to highlight here the drug felonies. You can see there was a really sharp drop between 2007 and 2010 in drug felon population. And if I took this back further, you would actually see a sharp rise first. So that highlights something else. This is where we can use the jail data to identify other trends in the criminal justice population. Starting about, this would have been around December of 2008, we were really getting concerned about the jail population. This chart here, actually, I kind of took it a little too far. But basically, 2008, we're starting to get a little concerned because we had that spike in the jail population, and now it's starting to flatten off. And we're wondering, well, what's going on exactly? What is causing the drop? And what caused the rise? And it was even a little bit more stark in the pretrial population. So we started looking for things that might have caused it. And we landed on a backlog in the Department of Forensic Science data. And basically these are a situation in which the Department of Forensic Science has obviously scientists who are analyzing drug samples, among other things, that come in. And they had a shortage in staffing. And so the cases were stacking up. And at the same time, we had a bit of an increase in drug submissions. And then they started stacking up even more quickly. And if you take that and you look at the DFS backlog and you move it forward about 12 months for like a lag in the effect in the time between the backlog peaking and when the effect was really felt in the pretrial ADP, we figured out, okay, well, that's really what's causing the rise. The drop-off is really just us returning to a norm, and so we expected, in the forecasting group, we expected the population was going to start growing now at the rate that it had for years, but it didn't. And again, we're looking here looking about 2008, we were wondering, okay, well, now why is it dropping? We now have a secondary concern. The rise was the backlog. This drop is something else, so we had to start going further. And this is really the point at which we started really looking at jail data, the data in LIDS, much more intensely and much more broadly than we had in the past. Prior to this point, we really had only looked at the aggregate data for the forecast. I've shown some of the offense data already, but we really weren't looking at it at that point. It wasn't really until around this point that we said, well, what else is available in that data, and what can we pull out and to get a better understanding? So when we pulled it out, we actually were able to pull out drug felons, and we saw that the drug felon ADP is really what was dropping. Drug felons, well, it's the pretrial ADP of people whose most serious offense was a drug felony. And you can see that is a pretty staggering drop. And again, we were looking at that right about this point right here or so in December or so 2008. And so we knew there was a drop. We saw this drop here. We weren't really sure what was going on yet. So we started looking at other trends. And we found out that it wasn't just a drop in drug felons in general. It was a drop very specifically in those charged with cocaine-related felonies. And we looked at the arrest data, and we were looking at it, again, right about here. And we saw that there was a drop in cocaine arrests. In fact, the cocaine arrests had dropped about 30% between 2006 and 2008. And then we went further and started digging into the forensic science data, and we saw that there was also a similar drop in cases being submitted to the Department of Forensic Science. And what we discovered is that there was a pretty tremendous drop in cocaine availability. And that was really driving the drop in jail population. And it was really, this is really what kind of made us see just about the value in studying the jail data to a greater degree than we had in the past, because there wasn't really much talk about, that we were hearing about a drop in cocaine. And we would even ask some people in the field, and they weren't necessarily seeing it because it wasn't everywhere and it wasn't all the time, and it wasn't like a drop to zero, but it did drop enough that it was having a profound impact on the jail population. All right, so that explains this drop here in the pretrial end of month population for drug felons. So you can see that there's definitely variations in the jail population by offense type. We also looked at variations by across the state. We can actually look at the data much, even more granular. We can actually start looking at committing court, which would be the county or city, but that actually starts to get to be such a mess that you can't really tell what's going on. So here we're looking at it by Virginia State Police Division. There are 7 divisions here, and the graph, the map here gives an idea of the level of the offenses and the changes, and the graph on the bottom, I have indexed it to FY 2009. So the first bar, FY 2009, here is always at 100. If it's below 100, then it gives you an indication that it's dropped since 2009. If it's higher, that gives you an indication of the proportionate increase. So you can see that although District 4 out in the far west has fewer offenses, has had a lower end-of-month population in general, they have had the most growth in that same period of time. Similarly, Division 5 has by far the highest population, but it has actually seen a real drop over time. So if we look at this, we can see that there's a few divisions that look very similar to each other, Divisions 4, 6, and 2. So when we go to the next slide, I put those all in one, and here we've actually got it broken out, and I know it's kind of crazy. And we're looking at most serious offense that they're charged with over time by division. And you can see there's a really consistent pattern across these three divisions across time within the various offense types. There are definitely some differences, but you can really see that they are, we're seeing a rise in a violent felony at about the same period. For the most part, the same changes in the drug felonies. So you can see that when we're looking at the drug felonies, we see here that they're actually seeing a rise in drug felonies at the same time that we were seeing a drop otherwise. I didn't get into this data here, but if we start looking at the target forensic science data, what we see is they're seeing a very different kind of felony in those parts of the state than the cocaine offenses. They're seeing more of the heroin and more of prescription drugs. All right, and here I'm looking at Division 5 and comparing it to all other divisions. And this is the actual level of the offenses. So you can see the Division 5, even though it's just one, is actually right up there with the rest of the state in much of this. And you can see that, again, it is division with the largest population overall, but its direction of changes has been very different than the rest of the state. And so it has actually been driving the drop, for example, in the drug felon population in the pretrial population. It's because we definitely have seen a big drop here that we are not seeing overall across the state. Well, it is not continued overall across the state. All right, I hope I'm not going too fast. I can't see any of you, so I can't really tell who's fallen asleep and who is on their phone. But I assume that you're all able to keep up. All right, so we talked a lot about the population. Now I'm looking at the commitments and releases to and from jail, because we can track that as well. But again, we start getting into some of the issues with the database. The database is excellent, but it does not have everything you might want in a database specifically for tracking offenders for the purposes of doing research. So you can see that we have a large number, a pretty high level of commitments and releases, although it's dropped off and basically flattened in the past couple of years. I actually don't have anything after May of 2013. As a side note, I have to start forecasting soon, and I am a little bit concerned because I'm flying blind. But that's my concern, not yours. All right, so this is looking here. So that was the level of commitments and releases. Here we're looking at just the distribution of releases, and this is over an average over a 5-year period. Local responsible offenders only, so I'm not including state responsible or federal, and just how many, where are they going? And you can see that the largest category by far is about 40% are being released to bond, but you also have a couple of large categories here, weekenders at 20%, and this transfer and confinement change 12%. And this highlights a problem with the data in that there's no field that tracks an individual throughout a single commitment, or what we might think of as commitment. If they come into jail in, say, the city of Richmond, and they get transferred over to the county of Henrico, and then transferred back to the city of Richmond again, that is 3 different commitments and 3 different releases that you're going to have, and there's no real intuitive way to connect those. I've tried to connect them on my end, and perhaps if I had some stronger SQL Server skills and a bigger computer, I might have been able to do that. All I've ever been able to do is crash my computer in the process. So there's really not any real good way to connect those, but it does highlight the fact that there's a lot of them and that you need to pay attention to it. This is looking at total releases, so it includes those federal and state, but it's broken out by all other and then weekenders and transfers. You can see weekenders and transfers represent about 30% of releases, and when in reality they are not what I personally tend to think of as separate individual releases and transfers, or releases and commitments. And this kind of skews the length of stay analysis. I'm going to show some length of stay analysis in a bit, but you have to always take that with a grain of salt, because if someone's been transferred 3 or 4 times, it's going to shorten their perceived length of stay. All right, so this is breaking out the other releases, the ones that are not weekenders or, that are not weekenders or transfers. And again, this is the local responsible releases, and you can see most of them are either released to bond or sentence time served. And you can see that over time, we saw a slight drop on average in release to bond and a slight increase in sentence served or time served. And sentence served and time served, I guess I should note real quickly, are 2 separate codes, and I'll go back a few slides here. And you can see that about 3% really are time served and about 16%, and again, this is of all local responsible, not after the other percentages are after I pull out the weekenders and transfers. Time served is going to be usually for individuals who have who came in pretrial, they made it to sentencing, and they were found guilty but sentenced to time served. And so that becomes their sentence, as opposed to those who are sentenced to serve time, serve it, and then are released sentence served. I'm seeing a question about weekenders being counted as released each weekend, and yes, they are. So each time for each weekend, so if they come in, if they are weekend commitments, they are an admission and a release, and an admission and a release, and an admission and a release. And so when I'm doing analysis for the purpose of trying to figure out whether or not admissions and releases have gone up, I usually look at weekenders completely separately, because I don't want to ignore them, because I do want to know is that increasing as well. We're seeing an increased use of weekend commitments. But I don't want it skewing the overall totals. Although it's hard to pull out transfers, so that is what it is. This is just looking at, just real quick, pretrial commitments. We're seeing an overall drop over time in pretrial commitments. Here we're looking at the same pretrial commitments. We're now breaking those out by offenses. And so the categories here: violent felony, drug felony, other felony, then misdemeanor or ordinance violation. And again, these are the most serious committing offense. So if you have a violent felony, you cannot be in one of the other buckets. And you can see that over time, we're seeing a slight increase in the violent felony category. We're seeing a slight drop in the misdemeanor. This is 2007, 9, 11, and 13, and a drop in the ordinance violators. So we haven't really talked much about the ordinance violators, and that is because let's look at the same thing for the population. They don't even make it onto the chart here, because ordinance violators actually make up pretty consistently less than 0.05% of the actual minimum population, because they are, in fact, not held very long. You can see that a large portion of the population, a large number of those admitted pretrial are in fact released very quickly. About 70% are released within 2 days, or less than 2 days. Although you can see that has been dropping, and on the other end of the spectrum, although there's a relatively small number, we're seeing an increase over here in the number staying 21 days or more. So we can break that out, because we can break out everything. We can break that out by offenses as well, and you can see that the ones who tend to stay, and this is an average of several years, the ones that tend to stay fewer than 2 days are primarily the ordinance violators and the misdemeanants. They're not the only ones, but those are, you know, the larger portion of it, and those who tend to stay longer are the more violent felons, which, you know, side note is basically, I think, what we would expect. But again, like we saw here, the proportion that are staying longer is going up. And if you have a slight increase over time, as we saw in commitments of violent felons, and a slight increase in the length of time that offenders are staying, then what you end up is overall with an increase in length of stay. And so just an overall increase in the jail length of stay, which can lead to an increase in the jail population at a time when commitments are actually going down. All right, so that is, I would think, probably more jail data for Virginia than you might ever want. See a question, are terms commitment and admission used interchangeably? Here I am using them interchangeably. Other agencies do not, because other agencies, they actually mean something different. Here, every single time a person walks in the door, they are essentially committed as far as the database can identify them. We don't have a separate category for those who have been committed and those who have been admitted. I know that there are other systems that do things a little bit differently. So again, looking back at the LIDS data, for the information that we've looked at so far, we could also have been looking at sentence offenses for those who have been, sentence dates and how long it takes to get to sentencing. We can get more detailed offense data than this, but it starts to get pretty messy when you really break it out. And we can get some limited gang identification, although that is not a mandatory field, so we don't have that across the board, but we do have some amount of that, which for those who are trying to gather gang information to get a statewide information, it is helpful and informative. And all this information can be broken out, you know, by jail, committing court, inmate age, sex, race, nationality, and probably more stuff that I just haven't even thought of. Things we don't have, though, and I didn't write these down, is that it doesn't have, say, education information or treatment information that's going on in the jail, or information about inmate family or that sort of thing. See, we use ASCO or UCR coding. Not within my analysis of it. What I'm using here, that we have VCC codes, Virginia crime codes, identifying the individual offenses, and those somehow match up to UCR. I can't really tell you how. So somewhere along the way that does happen, but where I'm looking at the analysis, I sometimes go down as far as the VCC code, but mostly I just take the broader categories of violent felony and so on. I should also say that I've been lumping together all misdemeanors. We can actually break those out by, you know, person-related, property-related, and other. I'm sorry, drug-related and other. But I just lumped them all together for this purpose. How we choose most serious offense? Most serious offense is based on pretty much the ranking here. If it is a violent felony, and that is identified in the statute. Our Virginia statute actually identifies violent felonies. So if it is a violent felony, then it is the most serious, regardless of anything else. If it is a drug felony, it is the second most serious, and then other felonies, and so on. For other purposes, other analyses, there are other ways to do that. DCS use LIDS to respond to external inquiries. Yes, I have. Although I haven't, the ones administered by Bureau of Justice Statistics. I have not done that. Comp Board may have, but I have not done that. Does LIDS data have a strong predictive value on how the West Virginia State Senate might change the course? Well, this is Virginia, but looking just at Virginia, I don't think so. I don't think that would be the case, but the LIDS data might help inform, and in fact, theoretically is helping inform policies that are implemented by the Virginia General Assembly. All right, some caveats to consider about the data. Again, a lot of this analysis is using the database for reasons other than intended, so it's not optimized. There's not a lot of cleaning to be done in the sense of errors. I mean, there used to be a lot more errors. Those have been cleaned out over time. The Common Board really deals with that. I've worked with them some to help identify some issues. But it's really more a matter of trying to find what problems are, how the data that you're looking at are actually measuring the things that you're thinking about or trying to measure. What do the terms mean, and how are things tracking? The fact that confinement status can be overridden is obviously an issue. The end-of-month data being influenced by the day of the week. And again, just the fact that the database isn't designed to track individual confinement, which again skews the LOS analysis and increases your overall count of commitments and releases. And so you could have one person coming into jail, being committed multiple times when really it's all one individual commitment for purposes of general of what the normal person would think of as a commitment. We can also use the database for some other purposes. One is recidivism analysis. We can pull inmate identifiers from LIDS, send that to state police, and then get that matched to identify arrests. We can send them to the court for conviction data and to the Department of Corrections for new incarcerations. We can also look at new incarcerations within the jail itself. Obviously, we don't have to send the data anywhere for that. I'm looking at trying to come up with a return to jail measure, looking at just offenders who've been released to bond and the rate at which they return to jail, just to get a sense of, well, how quickly does someone show back up in jail after they've been released to bond. And I'm still working with that because I want to try and figure out what needs to be excluded and what doesn't. We've used it to help with some program evaluations. So when we've done some recidivism analysis, we have essentially taken some programs, found those individuals within the jail recidivism analysis, and which was the entire population for that year, and compared the rearrest rates for the program participants to the overall jails. Then we were able to take because we were working with LIDS, we were then able to take the data from LIDS on offenses and also on number of commitments, and we were able to break out the offenders. We were able to break out the cohorts by offense history and able to show that we have more serious offenders here, less serious offenders here, and that the program was more successful with more serious offenders than it was with less serious. Someone's asking about how recidivism is defined. In Virginia, we define recidivism basically as rearrest, reconviction, or reincarceration. We have 3 separate measures. We do not include technical violations, which would be like a violation of probation or parole that did not involve another offense. If it involved another offense, then that's different. Then we say, within 12 months, 24 months, and so on. Then I also looked again at that return to jail measure, which is not by any means an official recidivism measure. We've also, I've worked with someone here in our pretrial services program to identify individuals who've gone through the pretrial services program, who've been screened by the pretrial services program, and match them to LIDS, and then identify, were they still in jail a week later, and then break out the data by using LIDS. So we break out the length of time they stayed in jail, or rather, whether they were in jail a week later, according to their offenses and some other information. Bond information is not available in LIDS, but it is available in a separate community corrections database. And that's basically it. There are other uses that we're kind of, again, we're kind of on the cutting, well, I don't know, cutting edge. We're on the cusp, I guess, of really understanding how we can use the jail data to better understand everything else going on in the system. And although I'm frustrated by not having data for the past year on jails, and I honestly do feel blind when talking about jails now because I don't actually know what's going on without the data, I am excited about what the data are going to be able to do, because I know that they've made substantial improvements to the system so that once they get all their kinks out, we should actually be able to do things like follow a single commitment all the way through and not identify them as multiple commitments when it's a transfer, and get a better, the confinement status is no longer be overwritten. So that's going to be a big help, and it'll be much better for understanding. And, we don't know what that's going to show. It's going to show that our prior understanding was totally wrong, or are we just going to get a better understanding of the details than we had in the past? But that's basically it for for what I have to show y'all, and I guess I'm open to any questions y'all might have.
Thanks, Baron. We're going to go ahead and open up the poll now. So while we're answering these questions that we have, if you could please complete that poll, we would appreciate it greatly. Baron's been answering questions as he goes, which is very brave of him. But we have some others that that came in ahead of time that we want to address. There's a lot of interest in pretrial stuff, so I want to ask you some of these pretrial questions. What type of bond information do you have available?
Well, LIDS does not have bond information in its database. We have a separate database actually housed here at DCGS, which is the Pretrial and Community Corrections Database, and that does have bond information. I don't know that we have it for the full state. I think it only exists where those programs are active, but that covers most of the state, about 80%, I think. So we can get some data from that, but we don't have it for. It's not directly linked to the jails.
Okay. And somebody had asked about violations of probation parole and whether that was a category.
There is a category of admissions to the jail that is they're considered pretrial, awaiting probation parole hearing. So there is a separate field for that.
But you haven't really looked. You haven't looked at that?
I have looked at it, and it's included in some of the stuff that's here. I just didn't. In some ways, like in the pretrial categories I was showing here, it was not included. It's a separate category. It's actually a smaller category than you would think.
Okay. And let me take a step back, as there are some questions about the actual data set itself. How are you getting access, or how do you get access to it physically?
The comp board, they actually have a secure website where they post the data, and I can actually go down and download it directly from their website. And they update it. When it was working, they were updating it on a monthly basis, so I was able to get the data pretty quickly. Then they would update a month's worth at a time because it's an enormous database, and then I would import it into Access, and that involved a fair amount of cleaning and formatting to make it what I needed it to be. So it could take time.
And that was initially. So how was this begun?
Well, it began with really we were just looking at purely at the aggregate count of the aggregate ADP for the 4 primary subpopulations, which is pretrial, pending charges, misdemeanors, and local responsible felons. We had 4 average daily population time series that we would combine to 1, and that we would calculate a forecast off of that. We would use time series statistics to generate a forecast. And that was really the only way the database was being used outside of the comp board. The comp board itself was using it for some of their work. I mean, obviously they're using it for the per diem reimbursements, but they also prepare an annual jail cost report and some other things. But they weren't using it for a criminal justice trends perspective. They were using it from a financial administration perspective. And really no one was looking at it. I think for a while, I think the database came online in, I believe it was 1998, and I think there was some concern about it for a while because it was just a different way of calculating it than it used to be. They had used to do a different way of gathering the data. Let's leave it at that. And for a while, there was some concern about what it meant and how you could use it. And for a long time, really, no one was using it for anything other than just the average daily population. It was really only when the jail population started going down unexpectedly after going up throughout history. Before that, we could find no recorded point in which the year-over-year population of the jail was going down. And so that was pretty shocking, and so that's when we really, dug into it. And again, that was like December 2008 or so was when we started really asking questions, and that's when I really started getting much more detailed data than I had before. Up to that point, I was primarily just getting the aggregate time series.
So how did that change come about? In other words, what did you have to? I guess my question is, what did you have to do initially? Was it a memorandum of agreement, or were they resistant to handing over the data? Were there caveats?
No, I've never had any problem getting data. I believe there was a memorandum of agreement with the Comp Board a long time ago, before I even got here, and it's just never been. We never had to reference it. They've never given us any problem getting the data. Going to the higher level of detail was more work on their end and on my end, but it was never, other than the work side of it, it was never a problem. And it really came up as just we were sitting in a meeting. We were having a mid-year forecasting meeting, which we don't ever do because we usually just meet in the summers. But we had a December forecasting meeting because the jail population was tanking and no one knew why. And the jail forecast is specifically my job. So I'm the one that really needed to figure out what was going on, and it was something that was literally unprecedented. And so I said, well, we know that the jail population is going down. We don't really know who's not coming to jail that used to. That's really what it boiled down to. Is we know that someone's not coming to jail. We don't know who isn't that used to be coming to jail. And so I asked for a greater level of detail than we'd gotten before, and that's when we started getting some of the drug offenses, and I started getting just much more detail, a much greater detailed average daily population data that I could sum up to get an average daily population of the various offense types and that sort of thing.
And what about privacy concerns, identifying information? I mean, are there identifiers, and how are those dealt with?
Well, there are definitely identifiers, and we keep the data on secure. The data is behind secured server, or theirs is on secured servers, mine's on a secured hard drive. And the identifiers aren't shared beyond them and myself. If we're matching to state police, then we will provide it to state police. But again, that's one criminal justice agency with another sharing the data. So it's just a memorandum of agreement issue.
Okay. So the state police are using it for what now?
Well, we can send the data to state police to get recidivism analysis on the population. Okay. Although it's not done too often. Jail recidivism analysis is a tricky thing because there's a lot of people.
Is anybody? Do you do any other sharing of the data? Do you or the Comp Board share the data? And would you share the data?
I'm not sure what you mean by share the data. We share aggregate statistics.
Okay. I mean the actual data set.
Yeah, that's not something that I would have any control over. I don't know what would be involved in someone outside of the criminal justice community in Virginia getting access to that data. I know the Department of Corrections has access to it. I think the Department of Juvenile Justice has had access to it, but I don't know of anyone other than Virginia State criminal justice agencies that have used it.
Okay, and can you talk a little bit about the cleaning that is involved, or maybe not so much now, but the initial, what kind of, how bad was it?
Well, it wasn't as bad as I'm trying to remember, because it's been really good for a long time. I know that initially what was seeming to be errors was really more a matter of getting a better understanding of what the database had. The fact that, for example, that the pretrials were being overwritten, or the confinement status, which was primarily pretrial, was being overwritten, would lead to I would get data at different times, and it would add up to different pretrial populations or pretrial commitments. And so that was really seeming like errors that we had to figure out, and that's when we started just getting a sense of how often that was happening. Really, the difficulty in terms of time is, one, it's a lot of data, so the queries can just take forever to run. But two, it's really just getting to understand all the quirks in the data, just, the weekender commitment thing, and, the misdemeanor spiking at end of month on weekends, and that sort of thing. And all of that stuff takes a while to really understand, and then to understand not just it in itself, but how it relates to everything else is the big stuff. I mean, that's where the time sink is.
And you're basically doing that by yourself? I mean, is there somebody at the COM board who knows the answers to some of these questions?
Yes, Ann Wilmuth, the Chief Information Officer at the COM board, is very helpful to me when I have questions. But really, for the analysis of the data, and particularly from, again, the criminal justice perspective as opposed to the financial, she understands the data better than anyone, but she doesn't work with it in that format. So early on, I was asking questions a lot, and at this point, I think I understand those issues. Now I try not to bother her because she's trying to help them fix the problem with the data being exported to or moved to DOC, and I don't want that problem. I want that problem solved.
And what about, have you tried merging this with other data sets like NIBRS, for example?
Not with NIBRS. I've tried. I wouldn't say merged. I've matched it to our the pretrial community corrections database, the PTCC that we have here, and I have matched data that was drawn from that to the data that I have from LIDS, and I've matched. I mean, that's probably the most true database matching that I've done. I've also done some other smaller data sets that came from other programs, but because there is identifying information on there, I don't send it anywhere for any other purposes. So if I have data from another program for that purpose, I'll match it to see what jail information can be pulled, but that's about it. And it actually, I mean, it matches reasonably well. Have you,
other than the uses you described, have people come to you with questions about this particular data, or do you, if you guys have a question in the SAC, will you pull out this data? And in other words, I guess what I'm asking is how useful is it beyond what you've described, or how generally, useful is it, say, compared to NIBRS or something like that?
I've found it tremendously useful. Again, because it's updated on a monthly basis. So I was able to know, I could get a much better sense, much more quickly get a sense of criminal justice trends from the jail data than I could from any other source. Because any other source, I had to wait. There's a lag, particularly with the UCR. I mean, there's at best several months lag. So I would say that I found the jail data tremendously useful. The only one I found anywhere close to that has been the Department of Forensic Science data that I've also been working with, and I also get that at the end of every month. So that's also very up to date. And it really gives these are 2 days that really give you a sense of what's going on in terms of what's changing month to month in the trends and where it's happening.
If another state wanted to do this, what would you advise?
If another state wanted to
try to see if this information's available, tap into this information, or maybe even get this information going.
Right. Well, I would definitely say that if there's any kind of money going from the state to the jails, then there's some kind of data. I mean, there's certainly some kind of data source that they can look at, which would provide some level of standardization of information. So that's really where I'd start is where that might be happening. I know that Virginia's system is very different than others, but my guess is that other states are providing at least some level of reimbursement, and that there's some kind of information exchange as a part of that.
Somebody wanted to know about cost-benefit analysis. Have you looked at some of the cost issues associated with the jails?
I have not. We have done some legislative impacts analysis. If we're looking at change, if they change, one law to increase the the severity of the punishment so that they would be moved to DOC instead of to staying in the jails, or moved from a misdemeanor to a felony. You know, how many of those offenders do we already have, and what kind of impacts that might have? So we have looked at things like that. And we've also gotten questions about we'll get questions from the General Assembly about really just what's going on in the jails in terms of like how many are we getting these offenders of various types, you know, because they'll be considering changing laws, and so what not official legislative impacts, really just I guess official interest, and they'll ask, and we'll run analysis on that.
I guess I'm curious too about, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to phrase this properly, but when you're as you looked at these data over the years, were there any places you went to that were particularly helpful to you in being able to understand some of these sort of quirks, for lack of a better term, like the whole weekend thing that you mentioned, for example? Or did you just have to sort of puzzle this all out on your own? Because it seems to me like there's so many, it's so complicated.
Yeah.
You know, that what you're looking at can be so misleading unless you know the data pretty well and you realize we better look at end of month versus average daily, and we better think about the weekend sentences, and we need to know something about how judges are sentencing across our state and that sort of thing. Right.
Well, some of the issues, such as the end of month versus weekend, versus ADP, had come up in the forecasting committee before I was part of it. So I knew that that was an issue. I didn't really know how to manage it. Most of the really, I guess most of the details in trying to figure out what's not happening that I think is happening and what is happening that I'm not aware of and all that, that's really, there's not much alternative to really just digging into the data. Yeah, actually, there is one help, which is that we have some corrections staff. We have a corrections programming staff down the hall from us, and they have an understanding of the data, of the system, and they can help me understand pretrial in a way that I otherwise wouldn't. And so that helps me understand data. So that's definitely a help.
All right. I think we've covered most of everybody's questions. I'm not seeing any other. I want to remind you folks on the phone that the slides and the recording will be available on the JRSA website, www.jrsa.org, within a few days. So if you had folks in your office or others that you know that couldn't be on the webinar today, they can view it. By late next week, it should be available. I'd like to thank Baron Blakely again and everyone who's on the phone for joining us today. We just found you a half hour, so use it wisely.
I talked too fast, I'm sorry. But you can play the video back at a slower speed,
there you
right?
Go. That's right, absolutely.
All right.
And if you play it backwards.
Yeah.
And we hope that you've enjoyed the presentation today, and we hope that you will join us for future webinars. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon.